Our first panel, entitled Describing Us and Them in Early Modern England, has two speakers, Louise Smith and Brodie Waddell. We'll begin with Louise Smith, who is currently a PhD student at Lancaster University, where her research considers the role of music and song in early modern dissent and protest. And the title of her talk is Libellous Song and the Community in Early Modern England from about 1600 to 1642. So, Louise, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that one. Okay, yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, this paper is part of my ongoing PhD research into the role of music and song in early modern expressions of grievance. I'm interested in how popular culture, such as song and rhyme, can serve as a medium for non-elites to express those grievances and to communicate with one another when official channels of complaint failed them. So my interest lies predominantly in the poorest and less educated members of English society, and so I kind of faced a problem of accessing material that had only really existed orally. And in order to access that oral and ephemeral culture, I went down the road of exploring bills of complaint, which mention and sometimes quote the rhymes and songs that are no longer extant. And these bills are those that accuse defendants of libel. And that's the crime of publicly circulating something scandalous or defamatory, and thus damaging to the reputation of another. And it appears that this was of an increasing concern to the authorities in the late 16th and early 17th century, and occasions of libel were becoming more and more commonplace. And libels were a really significant part of the middling and political culture in centres such as London and Oxford, as we shall see. However, accusations of libel were made against people from all levels of society. So Adam Fox has estimated that of the 577 libel suits heard in the Jacobean Star Chamber, 37% had defendants from those sort of lower levels of society. Therefore, I'm hoping to show that the value of libellous songs as a source material for the study of political and micro-political cultures in provincial England, and to show that non-elites were politically engaged, even if just with the politics of their own communities. Oh, my slide is not changing. There we go. Okay. So, one Attorney General refers to libel as the epidemical disease of those days. And part of the problem facing authorities was the multiform nature of many of these libels. So, for instance, this compendium of laws here delineates the many forms libel could take in the period. So writings and ballads, rhymes, as well as like jests and songs. We see libel in broadside ballads and pamphlets and all sorts of other cheap prints. I've got a couple of sort of standard examples. We've got a letter here and a rhyming couplet, which form part of a vitriolic campaign against a woman in Shropshire. There's also a handwritten ballad libelling a gentlewoman in London. And we have examples of visual non-verbal libels and performed libels. And several of these, they might have been pinned up or publicly sung in alehouses and coffee houses and such. So a considerable proportion of libels attack people on the grounds of sexual impropriety or moral transgression, but an equal number were directed at political figures or in some accused a person of abusing their power and position. Many of these are intrinsically subversive, as at the time, ordinary people are not supposed to pass comment on political affairs. So in 1606, Chief Justice Sir Edward Coke reaffirmed the laws on libel and asserted that any libel that could potentially incite a breach of the peace would fall within the purview of the Star Chamber, and that's effectively the highest court in England. And I always think it's worth noting that while the Star Chamber does go downhill in reputation under Charles I, during James's reign, it's still kind of seen as a pinnacle of royal justice. And Coke tightened those definitions so as to avoid legal ambiguities that might allow perpetrators to spread criticism and propagate dissenting views. His definition also meant that libel against private persons, as well as seditious libel against public figures and magistrates, could be tried before the king, because prior to this, private libel had been seen as a moral offence and had been dealt with in local or ecclesiastical courts. And Coke may have foreseen that a libel ostensibly against a private individual could in practice have broader social and political ramifications. And this, of course, is connected to the Jacobean notion that an attack on any royally appointed figure could be seen as an attack on the king himself. And this included local authority figures such as constables and justices of the peace. So in the cities, accusatory political libels abounded, and almost anyone who was anyone had something libelous about them sung or written or printed. So I've got some examples on the slides here, but Sir Robert Cecil is libelled numerous times for his political ambition, as was Sir Thomas Wentworth. And a libellous poem was pinned to the hearse of the late Archbishop Whitgift in 1604, slandering his character and his religious leanings, and those of his successor, Richard Bancroft. accusing of popish ambition and hypocrisy and all these sorts of things. And a great number of these high-profile libels have been collated by Alistair Bellamy and Andrew McRae on the online database Early Stuart Libel, which holds over 350 fantastic examples of this sort of thing. In particular, I've noticed that there seem to be an infinite number written about George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, the royal favourite. And these range from quite impressive verses containing really serious criticisms, so for one that's like 53 lines long and makes all these classical allusions, to others that are quite simple and basically offensive little rhymes. The important thing here is that we can't dismiss any of these as being merely rude or satirical. The couplet here, the final one on the slide, was written and posted immediately after the public murder of Dr. Lamb, who was an associate of Buckingham's in June 1628. And of course, while it's circumstantial, the Duke of Buckingham certainly did die like Dr. Lamb, because 2 months later he was assassinated in the street. And this raises important questions as well about levels of political awareness and engagement. It's not just among the learned elites, but also the so-called ordinary people who would see and perhaps hear these libels, especially as we begin to move outside the cities. So, in provincial England, I have a case in 1627 where 3 fiddlers are arrested in Buckinghamshire for performing libellous songs targeting the Duke of Buckingham. And these libels were sort of in the form similar to a broadside ballad and were sung, as many libels were, to popular tunes. Now, some historians have suggested that this is a rare example of a documented musical performance of a libellous song in Stuart England, and I'm hoping to show that this is actually a lot more commonplace than we might think, and that in provincial England, performance was far more common than writing them down. And this example alone suggests quite a few things to me. Firstly, that these songs are saleable and entertaining, and that there was a market for libels outside of London in rural towns such as Staines in Middlesex and Ware in Buckinghamshire, where this one circulates in particular. And that people are familiar with the form, they know what they're looking at and they know how to imitate it. Now, while there are far fewer examples of libels against high-profile figures outside of London, there are no shortage of libel cases originating in provincial England attacking local authority figures. I do have one more example of a slightly more high-profile one. In 1601, there's a bill of complaint submitted by the phenomenally unpopular Earl of Lincoln, Henry Clinton, complaining that he is ridiculed in an adapted May Day play. And we know that the people of Lincolnshire had legitimate grievance against him, with enclosure being just one of their concerns. He appears several times in the records accused of abusing his authority. In 1607, a libel was written about him and posted in the parish church at Caister, which is the one on the slide. And the libel, interestingly, ends, "Oh, it shall do us good to see those tyrants swallowed in their blood." And this sort of violent language is quite unusual for the rural libels, although it is not that different from the language of libels directed to sort of like the Duke of Buckingham and so on. And it's quite clear why it would have worried authorities so much. I mean, this is all happening in the same year as the Midland Rising, which was also about enclosure. However, the provincial libels go that one step further, I feel, from the ones we see circulating in the cities. The libels are often preceded or accompanied by legitimate action in the form of petitions. So, for instance, in 1598, the Privy Council noted that they were very sorry to find your lordship, meaning Henry Clinton's, name so often brought unto us by poor men's petitions and complaints. Therefore, the use of libel to address injustices or a failure to counter oppression through legitimate channels becomes quite apparent. So, my favourite example of this is in Yorkshire. In 1621, Thomas Sholetto, who is High Constable of Barkston Ash, he brings a bill of complaint before the Star Chamber alleging that George Thompson, a vicar, and William Pollard, an alehouse keeper of the nearby Aberford, and several of their associates had written and sung libels against him. The additional names in the bill here belong to fiddlers employed to spread the song. The libel was sung and performed in alehouses and inns, and apparently in diverse and sundry companies, much like the one in Buckinghamshire was. And to me, that implies premeditation. They've got a clear goal and they know who their audience is. So from October 1619 to November 1620, when the bill was submitted, the song was performed in local villages and towns: Aberford, Sherborne, Ferrybridge, Pontefract, Milford, Nottingham. And there's even evidence that it went further afield, reaching Seacroft, which is on the edge of Leeds. And the extract of the song given here on the slide accuses Sholetto of oppressing and abusing the poor. It also accuses him of nepotism. The justice of his name is his brother, who was a JP. And it appears that Thompson and Pollard had considerable grievance with Sholetto. Other extracts from the bill suggest that Thompson and Pollard knew exactly what they were doing and were willing to risk the consequences to get their grievance out. So, for instance, we know that Thompson took a petition to local gentleman Marmaduke Beckwith of Seacroft. And according to the bill's narrative, when Beckwith refused to help him, it was then that Thompson found Pollard and wrote and spread his libel, almost like a last resort. The fact that Thompson was a vicar is also particularly interesting, and there is other evidence of clerical use of libelling within the Star Chamber. So in Pilton in Somerset in 1610, there's a vicar who's accused of making rhymes and lewd songs against certain people he deemed to be sinful. This whole thing also suggests that members of the clergy might use libel to speak out against social injustice and advocate for the poor. So Julia Ingram, who was looking at sermons in this period, suggests that the parish clergy criticised enclosure and the so-called caterpillars of the Commonwealth that grew rich at the expense of the poor. She also argues that a good parish minister needed to enjoy familiar society with his parishioners and to exhibit an understanding of and respect for their quotidian working lives. Therefore, having a vicar who broke bread with them in the alehouse may have been very amenable to the parishioners, and the bill's claim that Thompson forgot of the duty of his function is the opinion of the authorities who imposed their own ideal of a parish preacher upon him while he stood up for his community. Ingram's assessments of vicars' role in the community, I kind of feel apply to this case in particular. Equally, there is evidence that outside of the city, the libels were much more a community affair. In the elite urban cases we've explored, libels are either entirely anonymous or attributed to one or two perpetrators, whereas in rural and provincial England, the situation is markedly different. So this table shows the numbers of defendants in a selection of bills that I've had the chance to transcribe so far. And those with stars are those with known performances, so like the May Day play against the Earl of Lincoln, and therefore had an audience beyond those mentioned in the bill. So there are two things that I really want to draw attention to here. Firstly, that rural and provincial libels are a social medium, and that libels targeting authority figures often had a significant number of known participants, not even including those who might have been in an audience. So we know that libels are performed to entertain, and like some of the Star's performances, we have mention of an audience whose numbers go unpreserved. So, for instance, in Uttoxeter in 1616, another justice of the peace was libelled by more than 12 local people who accused him of being a justice unjust. And among his many crimes, Kinnersley, the JP, is accused of oppressing the poor alewives by shutting down local businesses. And the main defendant here, William Tixall, he's a gentleman, but those that accompany him are not. They are tenants of the land. And this diversity is quite common in these rural bills. So I've got another libellous song from Northamptonshire against a local gentleman in Proctor, accusing him of looking down at the poor as well as abusing his position by confiscating corn and pigeons as well. And the bill names gentlemen, servants, yeomen, and many others as defendants as well. I've got another libel from 1621, which has a Chief Constable John Harrison balladed in Wapentack near Leeds. And the bill of complaint lists 22 defendants as well as diverse other persons unknown who took issue with him spending public funds. So many of these libels are aimed at local authority figures such as JPs, constables, bailiffs, and so on. And these bills often name numerous and diverse community members. And speaking of the frequency and potency of these libels, John Walter has argued that while the protocols of making complaint and petitioning in early modern England required the Commons to emphasise their humility and powerlessness, libelling allowed the authors to explore the empowerment that came from being able to express anger that in every day had to be kept in check. Therefore, we can see that libels prove an empowering medium for protest in these communities and appear to be employed alongside or instead of legally legitimate action. There is something more as well about the provincial libels that differs a lot from the urban verse libels, and it hinges on that social element and on performance and orality. The provincial libels bring in a whole new type of dynamic paratheatricality, elements of festive justice tied to folk rituals of misrule. That's like the ritualistic inversion of order. And this takes me on to that second point, that libel in provincial England became incorporated into a pre-existing language of complaint and folk justice. So in many of our cases, the offending libel was accompanied by elements of festivity or rough music, plays that emphasise misrule, or visual symbols such as horns, which infer cuckoldry and can be used to humiliate a victim. And these elements are typically associated with corrective action taken by communities against transgressive behaviour, such as sexual impropriety or moral indecency. I had two other examples on the slide, but I won't go back to them. One from 1619, a couple who were chased through the town, accompanied by rough music and sort of the ringing of bells and the shouting of chants. and another 2 gentlemen who are libelled on account of their wives' misdeeds, who have the horns of cuckoldry stuck up near their homes. Therefore, in the political libels, the choice to incorporate performance and music, especially in public areas like marketplaces, is reminiscent of these folk traditions. And the May Day play that helped mock the Earl of Lincoln comes from that same range of traditions as well, involving a lord of misrule, and has all the hallmarks as well of a charivari, that's a mock serenade. And the same is true of those that ridiculed Constable John Hole in Somerset in 1608 using May games, rough music, and more libellous songs. As John Hole was also a Puritan and a figure of authority attempting to control what he saw as unseemly pastimes, the very act of putting on the games, even without the libel, was social and political insubordination. So while I feel that it might be fair to describe these libels and accompanying activities as protest, the end goal is likely not as radical as we may presuppose. Folk justice was inherently corrective. In its efforts to humiliate and punish those that transgress the moral and social order, it may be seen as fairly conservative. Therefore, the use of similar methods to criticize political figures who are transgressing is unlikely to represent an attempt to overthrow authorities, but rather to correct them, to remind them of their duty and community role with the intention of ultimately restoring order to a community or locality. Perhaps it's not so much a case of us and them, but order against disorder. So whether we see these libels as weapons of the weak or as attempts to restore order, we're making contact with the voices of non-elites who are politically conscious and politically active. And it is noteworthy that while the elite verse libels printed and spread in cities are those most commonly remembered, those that had the most impact on people's lived experiences are perhaps those performed and produced in provincial England. So I will wrap up now. Libel is used to express grievance across the social spectrum, and libels take an enormous variety of forms, from complex poetry through to offensive rhymes, mock serenades, and festive plays. The most important thing, however, is that these sources offer a window onto diverse political experiences and political grievances in England. While we can interpret some libels as calls to violence and revolutionary action, aligning them with uprisings and murder, the majority of those to be found in rural and provincial England call instead for improvements to people's daily lives through the restoration of fair governance. In provincial England, libel therefore demonstrates the power of the community. People from different levels of society, be they vicars, gentlemen, alehouse keepers, or workers, come together to oppose oppression and unjust government. And the festive and musical methods make these social affairs and the common goals make them inherently communal. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Amy. That was really, really good. So we'll come to questions and comments in a little while. So we'll move straight on to Brodie Waddell. Brodie is Senior Lecturer in the Department of History, Classics and Archaeology at Birkbeck, University of London. He was recently Principal Investigator on an AHRC-funded project entitled The Power of Petitioning in 17th Century England. Brodie is also one of the editors of the Social History Society's journal, Cultural and Social History. So the title of Brodie's paper, as you'll see, is Parochial Petitions, Social Identity and Popular Mobilisation in Early Modern England. Thanks, Brodie. Over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, so here's my attempt to sum up a big chunk of what I've been working on over the past 2 years or so in 10 minutes. So we'll see how that goes. It's a bit of an experiment, and some of it is, I need to stress, very, very preliminary. You know, it's a first working over of some of the material we've collected and the data we've got out of it. So it all comes from this project, The Power of Petitioning, that I am working on with Jason Pesey at UCL and until recently Sharon Howard, who's now finished with the project, but was our postdoctoral researcher. So they're part of the, owe some of the credit for this. And the core corpus of what I'm talking about today is 1,408 petitions that we have transcribed and put on British History Online. And we actually have more than that that we haven't transcribed, but I've used that core corpus as in order to try and find some early conclusions that I'm going to be talking about today. So the key questions for today are, first, how much of this was going on in terms of local petitioning, in particular collective or group petitioning? Second, what were they trying to get at, these group or collective petitions that I'm going to be talking about today? Third, how did they represent themselves in these petitions? And finally, I'm going to try and spell out some of the implications of these findings for our wider sense of early modern society and social relations, and indeed politics. So let's start. Oh, well, there's the project. Please go visit the website. There's lots of good stuff there. But on with the interesting bit. So how many petitions were being submitted to the quarter sessions in early modern England? Well, this just runs up to 1620. And this is based on a sample of various different counties where we've got the data. And what we can see clearly is that there were not too many from in the late 16th century, though part of this is, of course, archival survival. But we can see clearly that by the early 17th century, they were happening in most counties, most years, and by, say, 1610, 1620, they were becoming very numerous indeed, especially in counties like Lancashire, Cheshire, Somerset, where they have really good archives of quarter sessions material, and it seems like most of the petitions that were submitted to the magistrates have actually been preserved. And there, in some cases, we're getting 50 or even 100 petitions per year that have survived to the present day. So lots is the answer to that first question. There were lots and lots of them. My estimate is something like about 1,000 a year by the 1630s being submitted to the 40 or so quarter sessions, county quarter sessions across England. So that's all petitions, but of course not all petitions are group petitions. We might think of them that as the norm in the modern period, but it certainly was not the norm in the early modern period. In fact, most of these petitions are from individuals. And along the right there, you can see some examples of each type. All of these are from the transcribed petitions on British History Online. So most of them are from individuals about individual concerns. Henry Wood, now a prisoner in the Castle of Chester, unsurprisingly petitioning for mercy in his court case. But then there's lots of others that are not from individuals, or that are a bit more than that. So one group that I was unexpectedly large number of them, I wasn't expecting to find quite so many, are petitions from individuals, but then supported by a group of subscribers who've attached their signatures to it. And you have, for instance, Roger Bolton managed to get 45 people to sign onto his individual petition supporting his petition. I think it was for an alehouse license. And then you have the ones that are working the other way around. So they claim to be from a group, but they're on behalf of an individual. So they're actually focused on an individual personal matter, but from a larger group. We whose names are here subscribed, and then 20 subscribers. And then finally, another obvious group are collective ones, the humble petition of the inhabitants of, or the parishioners of, and I'll get back to the specific language that they use in a minute. But altogether, what we're talking about is something like 25 to 30% of these local petitions were in some sense a broader effort, either a collective petition or a large group of people subscribing on behalf of an individual or perhaps a couple or something like that. So what were they trying to get at? What were they trying to, well, what were they trying to get? Well, when you zoom on these collective petitions and we focus purely on the pre-Civil War period, this is what we get. So the largest group are relating to poor relief. Sometimes that's pro-poor relief, that is to say they're asking for someone to get poor relief. In many other cases, it's anti-poor relief, that is to say they're trying to get someone removed from the parish because they don't want to support them. And also paternity, these are about illegitimate children who need to be supported by the parish, and they're usually trying to get the father to support the child instead. And then the other big group are local rates. Poor rates, but also constables' rates, church wardens, and rates to support bridges and highways, all sorts of other things. Between them, they account for a majority of these petitions. And I'd like to think of this group as what we might think of as public fiscal petitioning. It's about public funds. It's about who pays for what as a kind of group, as a parish, really. And then we have these other ones, which I'm not really going to be talking about today. There is plenty about litigation or requests for mercy. There's also a decent number about licensing alehouses or licensing the building of cottages, and then lots of other little bits and pieces. But the big group is really about public fiscal matters. So that brings us to self-representation, which in some ways I think is the most interesting bit, but a bit harder to to quantify, and I haven't really even made an attempt to do that. I've basically just looked through what we've got and tried to get an impression of what's going on there. And I decided to divide it into 3 groups, which I hope makes some sort of sense. The first one, and the one that we might expect, is what we might think of as corporate petitions. And this is what the person who sort of the most prominent name in the history of petitioning, David Zarat, talked about as traditional petitions from the pre-Civil War period. Corporate petitions are from an institution or a group that represent themselves as a single body. The humble petition of the parishioners of Plumstow, for instance, or, and this is one of my favorites, so I had to include it, a humble petition of the loud music called the Waits. So this is the musicians, the official musicians of Westminster, complaining about someone, an unlicensed musician, going around collecting money. So these are, there are lots and lots and lots of these. And what's interesting here is that they often don't mention a single name. So they are from a corporate body, not from an individual. And they often don't have any subscribers. So it's just sort of assumed that they are representing the whole parish or the whole guild or whatever it happens to be. And then we've got another group, which I'm calling delegatory. That is to say, it's about having a delegate. And these, again, are also quite common. So the humble petition of the churchwardens of Hambleton. You also have the overseers or the constables or the overseers of the highways. Or sometimes, and I think I've come across a couple of cases of the vicar of a parish basically representing the whole parish. And here they usually are named, but it's only a couple of individuals claiming to represent the whole parish. That is to say, they're acting in some sort of official or semi-official capacity to represent this broader body of people. And I think that's quite interesting because it's, of course, very opaque how exactly these things happened, but it tells us that there's some sort of a process going on whereby these people are presumably soliciting permission to represent themselves as the parish. And then subscriptional, which are the ones that we're probably most used to, but in fact are definitely a minority of the total, though I'm not going to try and claim how much of a minority. Even here you have a mix. So this first example I've given you, we whose names are here underwritten, and then a list of names, but those first few names are signing really in their official capacity. The minister, the clerk, the churchwarden, another churchwarden, another churchwarden, then 2 random names, and with many others, which I quite like. So in other words, implying a much broader sort of popular support there. So there are a group subscribing. Some of them have an official role, some of them don't have an official role. And again, they're sort of saying that they're representing this broader constituency. So I think that that's quite an interesting example where we can see these forms of self-representation being kind of mixed up together in a way that didn't seem to bother people at the time. There didn't seem to be a clear sense that you had to have it one way or the other, but rather whatever sort of made sense for your particular petition and the way that you organized. And then the most obvious of all, I suppose, is we whose names are subscribed, inhabitants of Wrigley. So this is where you get lists of subscribers. In terms of the number of subscribers, it ranged massively. It wasn't at all uncommon to find very small numbers, 5, 6, 7, something like that. In the teens was fairly common. Over 20 was quite rare, but you do find numbers in the 20s, 30s, 40s on rare occasions where you have clearly, basically all male householders in the village signing up to one of these petitions. So that gives us some sense of how they represented themselves. And that brings us on to perhaps the part that actually matters, the so what question. So what are some implications of these findings? Well, the first is with the rise of local petitioning and including the rise of this group petitioning and corporate petitioning, what you had in practice is that more and more people were getting involved in this process of political engagement. You had more people organizing petitions, you had more people participating indirectly by perhaps carrying it around to different households, and you had more people participating as subscribers as well. Now, I'm not at the stage yet, but I'd love to look at a particular county in detail and see if I can get some sense of how many people what proportion of the population would have subscribed or participated in a petition at some point in, say, the 1630s. I'm not there yet, but it would have been a very substantial amount, particularly in some counties where we have rich archives of this Quarter Sessions material. And what that meant in practice is that when 1640 and 1642 arrived, people already knew how to petition. And this gets on to the second and third point. So not only did they know how to petition, but they knew how to petition about things that we might regard as public matters. Now, these weren't political matters, the sorts of things that Amy was talking about with the urban libels. This wasn't about, you know, the high politics of court and parliament, but it was about public matters because it was about money and public money, but a very practical sort of form of it. And secondly, when historians talk about petitions, they often talk about petitions of grace versus petitions of justice. Now, grace would be the ones asking for mercy, saying, oh, could you forgive this poor man? He didn't really mean it. He shouldn't be punished. But these are petitions for justice. They're saying that something has gone wrong and that according to statute, and they sometimes directly cite statutes, according to justice, we ought to do it this other way. We ought to, you know, include this extra township in our rates, our poor rates, or we ought to exclude these people from poor relief or whatever it happens to be. So there, you begin to see this this language of justice becomes very important to how they represent themselves. And that brings us on the final mention, which is this issue of self-representation. And when I started looking at this, I expected, having read David Zaret, that I'd find lots of corporate ones, and those would be interesting. And then you'd get subscriptional ones from sort of the 1640s onwards. In fact, that's not the case. You find all sorts of varieties, different ways of representing themselves in official, semi-official, unofficial capacity, sometimes clearly counting on numbers to carry their case, in other cases, not worrying about numbers at all, and instead just sort of asserting the will of the parish as a whole. So what that meant, again, is it brings us back to this political question. What that meant is that by 1640, people all across the country, people of very, very low social status, including, you know, in some cases, paupers doing individual petitions, but especially householders of all sorts of different backgrounds, we're used to participating in this form of political engagement and thinking and negotiating their place within it. That is to say, deciding who should organize it, how it should be organized, whose name should go at the top, whether it should have a name at the top at all, whether you should get subscribers. So that meant that when Civil War broke out and when the revolution unfolded, people already were well adapted to this process. So I'll close with a sort of provocative point, which is to say, if we want to understand the Civil War and the Revolution in this period, we do need to understand this ordinary, local, practical petitioning that was going on in such a huge volume right up to the outbreak of the war in 1642. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Brodie. Really interesting. Thanks to both Amy and Brodie